At some point in the 20th century, the economy stopped producing things because people wanted them and started producing people who wanted things. The direction of causality reversed quietly, and the reversal changed what it means to live inside a modern economy. That claim requires precision. It is not that genuine human preferences disappeared. It is that the system discovered it could not rely on genuine preferences alone to sustain the level of consumption its productive capacity required. So it built a second system, running parallel to the economy of production, whose purpose was not to meet demand but to manufacture it. And that second system became so successful, so pervasive, so embedded in the texture of daily life, that it became almost impossible to locate where genuine preference ends and manufactured desire begins. This is worth taking seriously before dismissing it, because the dismissal is easy and reaches for something real. Standard economic theory holds that consumer preferences are given, that people come to the market with desires already formed, and the market's job is to satisfy those desires as efficiently as possible. On this view, advertising is information. It tells people what is available. People decide what they want. The transaction reveals their preference. Consumer sovereignty is the term, the idea that individuals are the final arbiters of value, that what people choose to buy reflects what they genuinely want, and that a system which satisfies those choices is serving human welfare. This is not entirely wrong. People do have genuine preferences. They have real needs. They have authentic desires shaped by their particular lives, relationships, histories, and bodies. The market that satisfies a genuine need performs a real service. The food that feeds a hungry person, the medicine that treats illness, the tool that enables craft, these transactions involve genuine preference satisfaction. The economic framework that enables them at scale is genuinely valuable, but hold that alongside something else. Edward Bernays, of Sigmund Freud, an architect of modern public relations, wrote in 1928 that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He was not describing something that was happening. He was prescribing something that should happen, and then spent his career making it happen. Bernays did not think of himself as a manipulator. He thought of himself as an engineer of social stability, someone who understood that the new industrial economy's capacity to produce vastly exceeded any spontaneous demand for what it produced, and that the gap had to be filled somehow. He helped fill it, through campaigns that taught women to smoke cigarettes as symbols of independence, through reframing bacon and eggs as the all-American breakfast to sell more bacon, through turning the purchase of a piano from a practical acquisition into a marker of family virtue. The products were real. The desires being attached to them were constructed. The construction was deliberate, professional, and effective. What Bernays began, the advertising industry industrialized. By mid-century, the psychological and sociological understanding of how desires are formed, how identity is constructed through consumption, how anxiety about status and belonging can be reliably activated and then temporarily resolved through purchase, this understanding had become the operational core of marketing. Not informing consumers about available products, shaping what consumers felt they needed to have in order to be the people they wanted to be. The American economy after the Second World War faced exactly the problem Bernays had diagnosed. Industrial capacity that had been built for war needed to be redirected. Victor Lebo, a retail analyst, wrote in 1955 that the American economy's ultimate purpose was to make consumption a way of life, to convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, to seek spiritual satisfaction, ego gratification, in consumption. He was writing as a description and a prescription simultaneously. This was not accidental or incidental to economic management. It was policy, embedded in advertising budgets, in the design of suburbs that required cars, in the planned obsolescence that made last year's product feel insufficient, in credit expansion that made the desired purchases accessible before the income to support them existed. The planned obsolescence point deserves a pause. General Motors, under Alfred Sloan in the 1920s, introduced the annual model change not because each year's car was technically superior to the previous year's, but because making last year's car feel outdated created demand for a new one. The product was not improved. The consumer's relationship to the product was managed. Desire was manufactured by making satisfaction temporary. The car that was adequate became inadequate, not through any change in the car, but through a change in the cultural meaning attached to owning a newer one. This logic proliferated across the economy and is now so universal that most people experience it as simply the way things are, rather than as the outcome of specific decisions made by specific people in specific boardrooms for specific commercial purposes. Now the floor move. The deepest issue with consumption is not that it is manufactured, it is what it replaced. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman argued that modern consumer culture performs a specific psychological function that previous cultures assigned to religion, to community, to ritual, to the cultivation of inner life. It provides a structure for identity, a way of answering the question of who you are. A sequence of acquisitions that marks progress, signals belonging, provides the experience of becoming rather than simply being. This function is not trivial. Humans need ways to experience themselves as having a self, as making progress through time, as belonging to communities that matter. In societies where traditional sources of these experiences, religious practice, stable community, craft and occupation as identity, clear life rituals, have weakened or dissolved, consumption stepped in. It is not simply a substitute for genuine meaning. For many people, it is a genuine source of pleasure, creativity, and self-expression. The person who decorates their home, who cooks with care, who dresses with attention, these are not victims of false consciousness. They are doing something real. The uncomfortable question is whether the economic system that provides the materials for this self-construction also systematically produces the insecurity and dissatisfaction that drives people toward consumption in the first place. Whether the anxiety that advertising activates, you are not enough, your life is not enough, what you have is not enough, is exploiting a pre-existing vulnerability or partly creating it. The honest answer is probably both, in proportions that vary by person and context and that are genuinely difficult to disentangle. What is less ambiguous is the ecological consequence. Global material consumption has roughly tripled since 1970. The extraction of raw materials from the earth, minerals, fossil fuels, biomass, construction materials, now exceeds what planetary systems can regenerate in several critical categories. The connection between consumption and ecological damage is not linear or simple. Some forms of consumption are far more damaging than others. The distribution of consumption across the global population is extremely unequal, and the relationship between living standards and material throughput can be decoupled to some extent through efficiency and design. But in aggregate, at the current scale and trajectory, the physical consequences of global consumption patterns are a primary driver of the environmental deterioration that we examined when we looked at growth. The irony is pointed. The system that generates the insecurity driving consumption is simultaneously generating the ecological pressure that will make the current scale of consumption impossible to maintain. It is cannibalizing the conditions of its own continuation. Whether this produces a managed transition to different patterns or a disorderly collapse of specific systems is genuinely uncertain. The people who study these dynamics are not in agreement about the timeline or the mechanism, and anyone speaking with confidence about either is outrunning their evidence. What is certain is that the current pattern has physical limits. Desire can be manufactured indefinitely. Planetary systems cannot accommodate indefinite extraction. Now look at what consumption does at the personal scale, not to the planet but to the person doing the consuming. The hedonic treadmill is one of the most robust findings in the psychology of well-being. People adapt remarkably quickly to new acquisitions. The car that felt exhilarating in the first month feels ordinary in the sixth. The house that represented arrival feels like background by the second year. The elevation in mood produced by a purchase returns to baseline faster than most people anticipate when they are making the purchase. The satisfaction is real but temporary. And the temporary nature of the satisfaction is, from the economy's perspective, a feature rather than a bug. It is what drives the next purchase. This is not an argument that people should not buy things. It is an observation about the gap between what people expect a purchase to deliver and what it actually delivers over time. The expectation that a different or better version of something will produce lasting improvement in how life feels is, For most purchases not well supported by the evidence of what actually happens after the purchase. People generally know this about other people's purchasing. They rarely apply it to their own. The industries that benefit from consumption as identity formation benefit from this gap remaining. The gap between the anticipated satisfaction and the actual satisfaction is what drives the next purchase. The business model depends on desire always slightly outrunning fulfillment. There is a word for a relationship structure where your needs are kept just beyond satiation so that you keep returning. It is not usually described as a feature of a healthy economy. Here is where this lands in your actual life, not as theory. As the specific texture of a Tuesday afternoon when you are browsing something you do not need and cannot quite identify why. The wanting is real. The question is whether it is your wanting or wanting that was placed in you before you had the awareness to examine it. And beneath that question, a harder one. If the wanting were addressed fully, permanently, not by another purchase but by something else, what would you do with the time and money that would free up? Not as an aspiration. As a genuine question about what is actually driving the hours of your life that organize themselves around acquisition, the economy has a very clear answer to what you should want, and when, and how much. It has been refining that answer for a century, using the most sophisticated psychological tools ever developed. You may also have an answer. The question is whether you have ever been quiet enough for long enough to hear what it actually is.